Thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion on civil liberties in India. I'd like to first introduce the Swatantra Center, which is a social enterprise which promotes choice and opportunity for all individuals to build a decent life with dignity. We believe in the idea that are particularly important for understanding and supporting the good society, a pluralistic society in which intellectual and economic progress is the norm, and where individuals flourish in a context of openness, voluntary and peaceful cooperation and mutual respect. I'm your moderator for today, Shaurya, and let me take this moment to introduce our brilliant panelists that I have with us today. Dr. J.P. Narayan is a physician by training and has served as a member of the Indian Administrative Service for 16 years. He had a tremendously successful tenure and held many important positions in the government of South Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. During the course of his service, he acquired deep insights into the Indian governance process and problems afflicting the nations. Convinced of the need of radical reforms to transform the Indian governance process, Dr. Narayan left the civil service in 96 and with like-minded colleagues founded a Foundation for Democratic Reforms, FDR, and Loksatta, a people's movement for governance and political reform. Since then, the Foundation for Democratic Reforms and Loksatta have emerged as a leading civil society initiative for government reforms. FDR and Loksatta have played a crucial role in driving several reforms over the year, including being focused on true federalism, effective and accountable local governments, rule of law, education, healthcare, and agriculture. Dr. Narayan, it's always a pleasure to have you with us and welcome you. The next panelist we have with us today is Mr. Sriram Kari. Mr. Sriram Kari is a novelist, writer, and journalist. Thank you once again to both of you, and it's, as usual, always a pleasure to have you join us. Now, to quickly dwell into this topic, as much as we might want, and as much as India is better than other countries, it's no illusion that civil liberties in India are really not at a paramount importance granted by the government. And it's often stated that the reason that the government doesn't give it a lot of importance is because the citizens themselves don't really care much about it. The recent Freedom House Index give India 37 out of 60 in civil liberties, which allows me to throw open the force and ask the first question to our panelist, Dr. J.P. Narayan, is, does the government of India really care about civil liberties?
Saurav, exercise of coercive power is always a complex thing anywhere in the world. Even in mature democracies, it's prone to abuse. Now, you see the last 1 week or 10 days in the UK, there's a lot of discussion because a young woman, a 28-year-old woman, or maybe 30-year-old woman, was brutally raped and murdered by a police officer. I think only this week that fellow was convicted. We all know about George Floyd murder in the United States. In our own country, your background paper listed many cases. The one case that struck me for some reason was at the height of this COVID sanctions. In Chennai city, a father and son, for the sin of not following the regulations, the restrictions on account of the COVID, they were innocent villagers, not particularly educated. They were beaten up so badly by the police that both of them perished, they died. So abuse of power, excessive use of power, or treating the people without power or influence with contempt is endemic in any coercive authority. In our country, unfortunately, the society has not moved from feudalism to modernity. The state has not moved from colonialism to democracy. We have the trappings of democracy. We certainly have elections and political freedoms and peaceful transfer of power and so on and so forth. But it would be wrong to claim that we are a full-fledged democracy in every sense, certainly not in rule of law. And there are serious deficiencies. Therefore, my approach would be to look at the institutional deficiencies and see how best to correct them. Just three broad areas. One is obviously, how do you ensure independence of the investigative and prosecution agencies? They are now entirely politically controlled. And therefore, you see, Whoever is in power is calling the shots, and they become the army of the ruling establishment rather than the servants of the people to enforce rule of law. The second is independence without accountability and disaster. In fact, if there's no accountability, I would prefer that they're actually controlled by the politicians. Therefore, how do you ensure accountability and oversight, effective oversight and accountability? The third is, how do you empower them? Because they're hopelessly inadequate in meeting the modern challenges. No, when you don't have forensics and so on and so forth, the common method adopted by most police in most cases is the torture, the third degree. And the conviction rate in India is among the lowest in the world, just about 50%. And if confessions extracted largely by brutal methods are excluded, then the conviction rate is only 10 to 15%. So how do really strengthen? All these three must be looked at holistically rather than make it a party political issue or look at one day's events. There is a larger process at work, and one area where there are many areas where we have been deficient in the past 70 years, but one area which requires very urgent attention, and that has implications on the society, liberty, and democracy and political evolution is rule of law. And let's hope that all of us can come up with some ideas which are practical, which are affordable, which are acceptable by all people, and which can be easily translated into action. And I believe there is an agenda. I myself wrote extensively in the Administrative Reforms Commission report on rule of law. And public order is the title, but basically led to rule of law. And recently we conducted a conference, a 9-day conference with some 50, 60 major figures in the country, jurists and lawyers and police officers and civil society leaders and civil liberties activists and so on and so forth. There is an agenda. There is a practical and sensible agenda, taking into account the stakes of all stakeholders. And it's not one or the other. We must take care of the rights of the accused. We must take care of the rights of the victims and the society at large. And there must be a harmonious balance. I think we have failed in a large measure, and we have to set it right.
On that point, JP sir, you have been a bureaucrat and a politician. But now when you're on this side, if, as you've seen multiple times, and as you pointed out, police go out and lathi charge on crowds protesting explicitly on political orders because their political masters might benefit into certain situations. In that case, what incentive do they have to leave those police be independent from their control? And what can we do then? How can we as citizens safeguard our rights from that situation?
Saro, it's not for the police to decide whether they should be independent of political control or not. They are merely the tools. Therefore, it's for the state structure, the elected governments and the society as a whole to decide. You can't allow the armed forces to decide what they would like to do with the arms they have. You can't allow the police to decide what they want to do with the legal powers and the weapons that they have. You can't allow the bureaucracy to decide what they want to do. That's what's happening in the country. Everybody in a position of some authority thinks that that power is personal. They can pretty much do what they like. Therefore, that question, I reject the premise. It's not for the police to decide. It's for us as a society and a polity to decide. The second broad thing is when we talk about protests, it's a bit more complex. It's very easy for us to see the world as black and white. Ambedkar, at the time of approval of the Constitution, he gave a very important admonition to the country, and we failed to recognize that. He said, look, in a colonial era, when there's no freedom, there is no vote, there's no self-government, we adopted certain methods of protest that worked. But in an independent nation, a self-governing democratic nation, there cannot be a protest that is obstructive or violent. I think we have completely failed in understanding this. All political parties, without exception, whether they're in power or out of power, they're guilty of this reckless abandon of the fundamentals of a democratic society. That there has to be peaceful reconciliation. There has to be peaceful, orderly, and non-obstructive protest. Is something that we as a society have ignored, and we actually romanticize violent and obstructive protest. That's part of our DNA, thanks to Mahatma Gandhi and Satyagraha and whatever be the Gandhiji's intentions. In actual practice, anything to defy authority, even if you do it unlawfully, obstructing others, rail roko, rasta roko, band, this, that, is perfectly legitimate is our notion. I think we have to have a very balanced view. You cannot run a modern society and economy by having a very skewed picture. Police are not the villains. They are simply part of this complex, vicious cycle. Policemen are like you and I. They are not people who came from Mars. But the moment they're endowed with some authority, as is endemic in this country, the people in authority, they tend to abuse power. That's true with bureaucracy in general. That's true with police. That's true with the politicians. That's true with many fellows who talk so much about liberties. The moment they are given some authority, I have seen them exceed that authority. So it's a larger issue of the notion of power, because we're still feudal in our society. Power is highly personalized. The second thing is, if you have to address these issues, we have to do it with great dexterity. A very omnibus, casual, or ill-thought-out solutions are very dangerous. As I said before, you must ensure independence of police, but where? Only in crime investigation, not in law and order. Whether you like it or not, management of law and order, crowd control, dealing with protest is a political decision. You don't deal with all protests in a similar manner. If there's a communal riot, you'll be ruthless. If there is a student agitation about some grievances, they go a little beyond what is right, you'd be much more gentle. That's what every country does. That's what every democracy in particular does and should do. Therefore, law and order can never be taken out of political control. We must be absolutely clear about that. But crime investigation must be taken out. And if there is an abuse of power in law and order, for instance, then there must be an independent mechanism to deal with that. Police accountability is an extraordinarily complex affair. I saw in New South Wales state in Australia years ago, there's such layer after layer. They have internal police procedures to deal with abuse and complaints. Then they have what is called inspector, who is part of the accountability commission, the police integrity commission, as they call it, in that as a part of that. And on the inspector, again, that inspector is a judicial officer. And if inspector fails for whatever reason, there's an ombudsman system. Ombudsman would take over. And even that they found is inadequate. Therefore, now they come up with the new institutional arrangements. So you have to have very complex arrangements world over. It's extraordinarily difficult. If you weaken the police and they can't really be effective in maintaining order or protect the constitutional order, that's a disaster. You have seen what's happened in Afghanistan. Last 2 months, Afghanistan must be very instructive for all of us. So you cannot allow that. You cannot allow Naxalites to simply take over the country. You cannot allow secessionists or extremists using weapons and extraterritorial connections to simply take over a society. That's a disaster. And the second thing is there is a hierarchy. Oftentimes, there is no clash between order and liberty. But sometimes, in an extreme situation, there could be actually a clash between order and liberty. And when that is the case, every society intuitively wants order first, because liberty is inconsequential when there's no order. We are all sitting and discussing, somebody comes and beats us up in our respect to rooms or houses or offices. What liberty are you talking about? There's no order. So there are so many layers in this. And there are ways of doing it. There are ways of creating independent police force, independent prosecution, not at all controlled by the political executive, having some kind of judicial oversight. There's complex layers of mechanisms. There's no time to go into details. And there must be an independent mechanism, further independent mechanism to look at the complaints and abuse of power. Independent, this is again judicially driven. So there are mechanisms. But the issue is, how do you create stakes? And I believe the way to create stakes is the police officers who are used to a status quo, but on occasion complain about political control, but are actually quite happy with this omnibus control of all kinds of police activity, from traffic policing to law and order to crime investigation. They must recognize that there are some areas that should be politically driven, some other areas that should not be. The monopoly of power over the monolithic power must be given up. The politician must understand that the areas where legitimately he should intervene, but the areas where it's in his best interest not to intervene. And this is one area. Normally, I'm not a very great fan of judicial overreach in the country. But this is one area where we must probably even formally bring in judiciary in the form of oversight into the police functioning in the crime investigation. And even prosecution. Just like, we bring law secretaries from judiciary. In many states, law secretaries come from the judicial branch of government. And they go back to judiciary after their tenure. Similarly, prosecutors at district level, something like a DA can be brought here. He must be made utterly, obviously, independent because institutionally and career-wise, that person is independent. And whole prosecution in the district will be under them. So the deficiencies can be overcome. And all this while improving the infrastructure and empowering them. Without adequate forensic capability, let me give just one number. In all of India, in 1 year, the DNA analysis is done in only about 20,000 samples. Typically, a criminal case requires 5 to 6 samples. That means only 4,000 cases. In the United States, they do import about 1.2 million cases in each. So, where is the infrastructure? In the 21st century, if you don't have 21st century infrastructure, but you want 21st century methods, and yet you want to maintain order and some modicum of peace in society, it simply doesn't work. We have to also invest. Our expenditure and investment in law and order, including rule of law, including judiciary, prosecution, crime investigation, etc., is about the lowest in all civilized societies. So look at it holistically.
We have still, I think, just 8 central forensic science laboratories all over India, out of which most of them are understaffed or don't have the actual equipment to do the forensic science test. I'll come to Mr. Kari on the order versus liberty dichotomy, but JP said a quick question for you. From what I gathered, you said a lot of the problem is because there's a lot of power in the government roles and the political role. So in that case, would you say that reducing government's power would increase civil liberties in India?
No, in a broader sense, the problem in India is the government has taken upon itself too much and does it too badly. It's all-encompassing and extremely inefficient. What we require is a narrow role of the government, but efficient role of the government. We have an overarching government which is extremely weak and ineffective. It's only good at abuse of power, but not actual delivery. Power in our country, it seems, has no content without abuse. The ability to deliver is absent. So sans delivery, what is power? It's only abuse. So in a broader sense, we must define the role of the government much more narrowly. And to the extent that they have to deliver, we must empower them adequately. In our country, we do neither. The overarching power, the intuitive approach of Indian people, the normal belief, the default option is almost anything government can do. The government is Raja. We must give up that notion. Government is here to serve certain functions we entrusted to them with our tax money. A lot of our life is in our hands. Government is not our Maibab. And to the extent that the government has to deliver, it must be adequately empowered and adequately resourced, period.
Thank you so much. JP, just moving a bit away from police. Shriram sir was talking about high courts and Supreme Courts and all, but coming a bit lower, when in litigation, we generally consider the first line of defense for civil liberties is supposed to be the magistrates in India. Most of the executive magistrates and all. But you've seen multiple cases, even in the case in Tamil Nadu that you mentioned in the beginning. When the victims were brought before the executive magistrate and were in bloodied clothes, the magistrate just sent them back into police custody without even asking why are their clothes bloody. There have been certain videos which have currently been circulating of executive magistrates ordering the police to lathi charge and break protesters' heads and all. Right? So the very entities just supposed to be holding our civil liberties and protecting them don't. Is it still due to the colonial structure that we have? Or is it a symbol of a bigger structural problem that we have right now?
There are 2 factors at work, Surya. The first is, as I said, colonial. We have in every society a clash between colonial or traditional values and attitudes on the one hand, and the constitutional aspirations on the other. The instruments that you have, sometimes the laws that you have, as Shriram has pointed out, and of course the attitudes we harbor, if they are colonial or medieval, but you have constitutional aspirations and liberties, the challenge is how do you bridge the gap? In an extreme situation like an American Civil War, it may be a brutal civil war and bloodshed. That's not what we want. There has to be this transition. There must be constant attempt to improve the institutions and to reform. That's the true meaning of reform. In India, we have failed to do so. Even today, typically, I know for a fact that in definitely the parts of India where I grew up, if the parents in poorer sections nowadays, and I suppose in the olden days, almost all sections, if they wanted to discipline a baby, a toddler, a child, what are the two words they use? Adugo buchi word. What is that buchi? Bussy, the French general who conquered for some time Masulipatam port, etc. He was a source of terror in coastal Africa. Or the second one is police. Adugo police. Right from early childhood, you inculcate the notion that you must be scared of the police. It's a colonial value. It is directly clashing with the constitutional rights and the principles. But there is a second element in this. Whenever there is a change in the societal order because of economic change, globalization, greater exposure, greater awareness, urbanization in particular, so on and so forth, the needs are changing. And unfortunately, our institutions and governance are not keeping pace with that. What we have seen so far is nothing compared to what we're going to see in the coming years. Already we are seeing in urban India, increasing demand that the policeman must abuse authority, indulge in extrajudicial executions. And doesn't matter how, but if he's the culprit, therefore he is a rapist, he did this, he is a molester, therefore kill him, lynch him. That mentality is growing. But so far, our society is held not by the police or the laws, but because of a strong family in an agrarian rural society where everybody knew everybody else. There's no anonymity. And therefore, the social controls, what will my parents think, what will my family think, what will society around me think of me, that is what held people to a certain standard of behavior. Sometimes good, sometimes could be bad also, but whatever it is, there is a certain societal norm which is prevailing. But with increasing urbanization and migration and impersonal lives, that simply cannot continue, even if you want it to continue. And there are features of it that should not continue. That's what Khap Panchayats are about. And unless the instruments of state, instruments of rule of law are able to both handle the potentially increasing crime in the country and do it with protection of civil liberties, ensuring harmonious reconciliation between the two, we are going to face a disaster. We are still seeing nothing. India relatively is crime-free. Most people think, my God, India is totally crime-ridden. It's not true. We have about 377 crimes registered for 100,000 population in a year. United States has violent crimes alone, serious crimes alone, 2,500 crimes per 100,000 population per year. Britain, all crimes, 7,500. You take almost any parameter of major crime, India would be at the very low end of the spectrum, very low. That will not last. The traditional society enforced certain code of conduct, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And therefore, the deficiencies of policing were not really seriously very costly. But that's no longer true. It's not a surprise that Delhi has the highest crime in the country. The number of abductions or rapes per 100,000 population, Delhi is by far the highest. Much of India is going to be Delhi, or worse. You go to Lahore today, or Mexico. Life is a disaster. It's unbelievably bad. The fear of crime, the fear of abduction, fear of molestation, rape, mafia, organized crime, etc. Almost everybody has a story to tell. My friend, my family member, my girlfriend's brother, whatever, everybody has a story to tell. So there is a tremendously, earlier you asked me, what are the incentives? Why will they change? Society may not understand the complexity of it, but society intuitively understands that crime is growing and my children are in greater danger. Now, what we should do, the opinion makers, those in power or those who have merely some influence, is to make people understand that there's a link between what we seek in terms of justice and safety for our families and the institutions, the way we build them. I'm an optimist. I believe that will happen. And even the people who are now have vested interest in status quo, the police officers who enjoy a monopoly of power, therefore, while they occasionally complain, don't want real change. The politician who actually controls time investigation, therefore, he can harass his opponents and protect his supporters. They may feel that they have an incentive to perpetuate status quo. But a politician who fails to control crime is ultimately in danger. It may be slightly more long-term, that's all. A police officer who becomes an object of revulsion instead of respect is not going to be happy. Therefore, it's a matter of time. But without things becoming uncontrollable, wisdom demands that we do it now and prepare the people, make them see the links between what we seek in terms of reform and what they seek in terms of safety and justice.
Thank you, JP. We have a lot of questions from the audience, but before going to that, just a quick follow-up, JP Garu. Would you say, because you mentioned a number of cases registered, would you think that the number of cases registered is a good matrix, or the number of cases that are actually solved? Because in India, there might often be cases where you'd rather not go to the police to file a case, because that might be a bigger issue for you.
Saurya, undoubtedly some cases are not reported, but it's take a totality aggregate. Not many crimes are going unreported. Rapes, for instance, is one area where perhaps underreporting is very huge because of social stigma, etc. But many other crimes, unless they're very petty things, they will be reported. What you're talking to about civil cases. Civil cases, most people don't even bother to go to a court of law because they believe there's no justice there. Therefore, they swallow injustice, suffer silently. With tears in their eyes, they would much rather not go to courts. That's why India is unique. Out of the 3.6 crore, 36 million cases pending in courts, India has 29 million cases, 28, 29 million cases, or 26, 27 million cases are criminal cases. World over, civil cases are twice the number of criminal cases. India, criminal cases are almost 3/4. It's not an accident because there are missing cases. Civil cases are simply not going to courts. Criminal cases, some may be underreported, but the totality cannot be, it can't be 90% underreported, maybe 5-10% underreporting. Therefore, that number has validity. And we have to improve the accuracy of the number, but we have to have a number. We can't simply, in India, we're very fond of talking in the air without any data. We have to improve the accuracy of data, but you can't simply have non-data as the basis of argument or discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. J. Thank you so much, sir. Now, there are a couple of questions which have come up. I'll try to take as many as we can as far as we have the time limitations. So the first one that I see here essentially is about the challenges of democratic government in the midst of emergencies, considering we just crossed one. How do we ensure that people can hold their own civil liberties are safeguarded in the middle of an emergency? Because we just passed a pandemic emergency and we saw our civil liberties just going out of the door. So I'd go to ask both of you to weigh in quickly on this.
Saurya, what we don't often acknowledge and what the people in authority don't adequately realize or articulate is, on the whole, Indian people are amenable to following a sensible law or a rule. Now, while we all know the chaotic traffic of Hyderabad, therefore it's very difficult to believe that we are actually law-abiding. But that's an exception. And that's because we are particularly loose in enforcing the traffic conduct. But otherwise, Indian people don't generally defy authority mindlessly, provided the law or the rule seems to be sensible and the decisions made are in our interest. Even if there is a short-term strife, people are willing to endure that pain for the good of the society or for the long-term good. And therefore, coercive use of power must be absolutely minimal. In case of pandemic restrictions, I find it absolutely amazing that physical violence is used against people who did not follow the COVID norms. It's ridiculous. Yeah, maybe a monetary penalty after a couple of warnings would be good. But there's absolutely no case for use of force. And it's not necessary. In all my experience as a district magistrate, and I was not one of those namby-pamby, incompetent buffoon. I was regarded as a very effective district magistrate. I never had to use force. The moment even if there's 10,000 hostile crowd, the moment I stood up and said, this is not it, this is the way, almost always there is compliance and there is orderly behavior. You must be consistent and you must have credibility. And you must be balanced and rational. Once these three things are assured, you're not doing something outrageous, you are consistent, and you have the credibility, the past record, people generally comply. Therefore, use of force must be the last resort. Yes, if there's a communal riot, I would unhesitatingly say, go shoot the fellows, as many as is possible. If they simply come and kill people or use knives, etc., no mercy there at all. But these are exceptional. In general, use of force must be the last resort. But when you use it, you must be decisive. You can't be namby-pamby about that either. We are very confused in our country. We resort to use of force very casually. When there is use of force, we think that there should not be any injury. No. Either there is use of force or there is no use of force. There can't be both the situations coexisting. This confusion is absolutely dangerous for the country.
Thank you, Sanjib.
The body language of being closer to a democratic reality and ideal that we would wish than the feudal. I don't even know which century they belong by, and I engage with cops regularly at the SI level, SHO level, constable level to slightly up. I know how they think. You have to just get a few cops fired. I am giving you a target, 5 DGPs, 25 commissioners. Let's randomly select 20, 30,000 cops, limited across. Let us give that power to some mad tyrant. Let them misuse. We'll tell them you take bribes and fire good cops also, no problem. Let the fear go in cops, you can lose the job. Problem solved.
Sorry, I wish it were that simple.
Would you want to weigh in on this?
Sriram, like many citizens, in a moment of anger, is simply giving expression to that anger. But no, what he says applies equally to a large number of politicians, bureaucrats, judges. If you go about randomly punishing or sacking people, it will be a recipe for disaster, is self-evident. You must have a very strong system of accountability. But if you don't have a properly designed mechanism to enforce accountability and pick the right targets, it will be extremely dangerous. In fact, it will go against the best cops, best politicians, best bureaucrats, best judges. If, however angry we are, we must hasten slowly. We must be extremely thoughtful. Otherwise, it will be a recipe for anarchy. And already there is far too much of anarchy in our governance process in the country, arbitrariness. I'm sure Sriram doesn't mean what he says, but he's basically expressing anger, that sense of urgency that I share completely.
JP said, do you disagree with the idea of firing corrupt cops instead of putting them on suspension and all?
No, I completely agree with firing not only corrupt cops, but corrupt bureaucrats. I repeatedly asked the Prime Minister in the wake of demonetization. One, it was done badly, demonetization. But even if it's done well, with the benefits to accrue, you must identify the most corrupt officials in the country. 1,000 at the national level and 100 in each major state must be removed under Article 312, not randomly, not casually or flippantly. There is a due process. There's a way of identifying people. During the infamous emergency, actually, in some of the states, they identified the bad apples and retired them quietly, effectively. So there are ways of doing it. You can't do it randomly out of anger. There must be a due process, a transparency, and a standard met, and constitutional values cannot be ignored. Whether you like it or not, there is a constitutional system still operational in this country.
Thank you so much, JP sir. Thank you so much, sir. Since we have positive time, I'll end with one final question and I'll take a last comment from both of you. One of the questions that you asked is judicial independence supposed to be a prerequisite for a good rule of law in India? Or is it supposed to be a part of government?
I don't even understand the question because judicial independence.
I think what the author is trying to ask is, do we need if we have an independent judiciary, would we automatically end up having police reforms as such? Or should we focus on?
We have independent judiciary, but we haven't had police reforms, right?
Yeah.
So the question answers itself. Our judiciary is undoubtedly it's incompetent, yes. That's a different matter. But it's independent. It's institutionally independent. If some people choose not to be independent, it's not because of the constitutional structure or the law. So we do have independent judiciary. That's why independence is not enough. Accountability, efficiency in delivery, serving the purpose. Everybody in India wants independence. Election Commission, successively, they keep writing to Government of India, give us the same status as the Supreme Court and give us separate budget, not voted by Parliament. Tell me which election commission was denied by which parliament any money for conduct of elections? So these are all myths. You don't require more protection as the election commissioner. Already you have enough protection. So we have this self-aggrandizing notion that my budget should not be voted by the parliament, that my employees should be completely under my control and they'll be appointed as I please, but there should not be overall architecture. So every agency of government wants to declare independence at the cost of the country in the name of the people. So independence, yes, but accountability along with that. Now the Information Act, which we brought with great effort, Calcutta High Court went to the Information Commission and argued that the Act does not apply to them. I was very careful while drafting. I particularly took care of that provision that every authority constituted under the Constitution of this country or the law of the land is a public authority. You know what Calcutta High Court claimed? They said that we are not created by the Constitution. We pre-existed the Constitution. We were appointed by the Charter of the Queen of England. They went to that absurd length. So every institution in the guise of independence cannot be unaccountable. Independence is to serve a purpose, not to aggrandize themselves.
For his final closing comments, the only time I had a police change how they behaved with me was when I asked them if they know which section they charge my client under. It's after I asked them which law, but when I realized they didn't know which law they were charging him under. But that does help if you start asking them. Dr. JP, your final comments.
Sorry, I'll be brief. First of all, we must not assume that everybody in police is a bad fellow. Actually, a lot of people are hardworking, honest, public-spirited, working against heavy odds to protect public interest. In fact, police in India are extremely overworked, under-resourced, understaffed. We have among the significant countries the lowest police population ratio, the lowest infrastructure. In a very complex, diverse country where many political failures are converted into law and order problems. The police, because they wear the uniform, they are visible, they are seen as the enemy. The issue is much more complex. Therefore, vilifying the policeman is not a solution. In the United States, for instance, they said defund the police. There's nothing more absurd than that. It's like defunding your hospitals. It's like defunding your defense forces. It's like defunding your administration. What rubbish are we talking? There is a problem, we need to fix it because no state, no society can function without the coercive arm of the state, because the purpose of a government, as Gladstone said, is to make it easy for people to do good and difficult to do evil. And the tools are the law and the law enforcement machinery. Without that, it's only talk. Ordinarily, in a sane society, for 95% of people, there must not be recourse to law enforcement machinery. But on occasion, for a small number, that is necessary. And if that is not adequately and efficiently and honestly and constitutionally validly deployed, there will be anarchy. So let's not make the policeman or the bureaucrat or the judge or the politician the enemy. It's very easy for us to see enemies all around. It's a typical filmy kind of a thing. A polarity, a protagonist, antagonist. There's a clash and protagonist wins, antagonist is doomed. And the life doesn't work like that. The second is, I'm a great optimist. Things actually have improved considerably compared to what they were 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 30 years ago. There's a lot more accountability, a lot more responsiveness. I'm absolutely certain about it. Is it enough? By no means. But is there improvement? Yes. Better is good. But there's a gulf between what should happen and what is happening. And that's where collective informed assertion, not merely anger and lashing out, but collective. Individually, if you fight, sometimes you could be victims. That doesn't help us. I don't want martyrdom. Collective, but informed. Without knowledge, simply without insight, some insights. Everybody can't be an expert everywhere. But without some real understanding and insights, if you argue, Shor Machana is very Indian. Everybody everywhere makes noise. God knows what they're doing. In this tent, there's one noise, another tent, exact opposite noise. Both are equally good. Both are heroes in our eyes. Absurd. We have become illogical. The decibel level cannot dictate our attention. That will not certainly make change possible. It must be rationality. It must be based on evidence. It must be based on best practices and our own past experience. And then the assertion of the informed citizens, even if it's a relatively small number, has profound impact. As Margaret Mead said, That's the only thing that ever changes the world. It's not millions of people marching on the streets. Let you out a secret. The Lokpal bill, millions marched. That didn't make a difference at all. It's a myth. In fact, they marched for a concept which is sound, but for a bill which was very flawed. It was a stupid bill, well-meaning. Everything well-meaning is not sensible. We must not be confused because these are good people. What they're saying is good. No, good people may say stupid things. That's why informed, wise. Not everybody can be enlightened, but at least a small group of people. At least if we are all discussing, at least those who are interested in a particular thing, today it may be rule of law, tomorrow may be healthcare, day after tomorrow may be education, the day after something else. It doesn't matter what it is, but we have an obligation because every decision we make or every slogan we articulate and every advocacy we indulge in, if it's implemented, has profound consequences to millions of people. It's an act of arrogance to be reckless in our demands or in our articulation. How dare we believe that we know about the millions of people, what is good for them, unless we are so grounded, so thorough, so knowledgeable, so experienced, so capable of absorbing others' experience and learning with humility. I cannot underestimate its importance. I cannot overemphasize its importance. It's incredibly important. And finally, I believe that the world is changing and India is changing too, but it must change much faster. Our economy is simply performing suboptimally. Our country's global influence is suboptimal, largely because we have not set our house in order. This is important not only from our own personal point of view, our own liberties, our own economic prosperity, our incomes and our future, and our level of comfort and harmony in society. From a broader humanities point of view, what we do in this country is important. China, with its model of an illiberal autocratic government, but very efficient delivery of services and economic growth, has become a very powerful magnet. Earlier, we all assumed that liberty, economic freedom, and rule of law and equality before law automatically guarantee prosperity. For the first time, that is being challenged in the global arena. And if India fails, not only a failure for the 1.4 billion people of India, not only it miserizes our population, it actually sets a terrible example to the world. In a very fundamental sense, would have failed mankind. And many Indians, rightly or wrongly, claim that we are Vishwagurus and all that. I don't know if we are Vishwagurus, but at least let's not set a bad example to the world. We have an obligation to ourselves and to the rest of the world. But I believe that all is not bleak. There's a lot that can be done. And there are ways of doing it in a practical way, in a sensible way, in a societal sense, non-disruptive way. While we require disruptive ideas, you cannot allow social disruption. Societal disruption is anarchy. So there are ways of doing it. And I really want all the participants and people who are looking at it, be thoughtful, be committed, be informed, and assert collectively. I'm sure we'll make that change happen. It may not happen during my lifetime fully. I embarked on this journey hoping that in 5 years' time, India will be transformed, because once you are a student of science and technology, once you have evidence, you have logic, you have a solution, it must be implemented. But in real life, world over, it takes time. Sometimes it takes unreasonably long time. You can accelerate the process. We can be very smart about it. We can be better at communication, but you cannot always compress time. But no matter how long it takes, let's accelerate it, but let's make it happen. We owe it to ourselves. All the best.
Thank you so much, Dr. G.P. Narayan. And thank you, Srinath, sir.